This lesson is going to talk about myth and structuralism. Special note, I cannot pronounce anything in French, so I apologize to what I'm going to do to some of these words. Keywords today are connotation, denotation, langue, and parole. If we're going to talk about structuralism, we have to talk about a major theorist in the field, Roland Barthes. Here are a few basic characteristics of structuralism you should be aware of before we get into Barthes' ideas. The first is that systems are composed of interacting elements that make up a whole. The second is that every system has a structure with universal laws that do not change over time. Structure is ruled by relationships of difference. For example, this is not that, which is not that other thing, which is not that other thing, and here are the differences between them. The third thing to keep in mind here is that structures are real things that underlie the surface of phenomena. In linguistic structuralism, as described by the Swiss theorist Ferdinand de Saussure, you have langue, which are the abstract, weird, non-individual, and pre-existing signifying systems which exist independent of the individual, and parole, which is the concrete use of langue on a day-to-day basis. Parole is more real than langue. So in essence, parole is what you use on a day-to-day basis when you're communicating with people. When reading Barthes, it's helpful to remember one question. What is a myth? Myth for Barthes wasn't just stuff like Zeus or Icarus, but a representation of the shared existence of our community and a reflection of the demands and values of that community. For Barthes, myths allow us to articulate our lived experience and talk about ourselves and our lives in the world, which helps make the chaotic and complex nature of life understandable. We can rely on the underlying logic of the system, as well as our emotional affiliations, to analyze and make sense of our reality. This brings us to semiotics, which is the study of signs and symbols, which was a key part of Barthes' work. Barthes viewed cultural myths as second-order signs, which in semiotics can be called connotations. A connotative meaning is a meaning which doesn't represent the qualities of the thing or idea on a surface level. It involves some degree of ambiguity. We have to take context into account, as well as cultural context. And information like who's saying it, what's our relationship with them, what's their relationship with us, etc., etc. When we hear somebody talk about UNC, we have to figure out which UNC they're talking about. The campus, the culture of one group on campus, the culture of another group on campus, how those cultures intertwine and interface with one another, the nature of being a humanities student, the nature of being a science student or a medical student, etc., etc. Question 1. Describe a myth in your life. What does it denote? What does it connote? One can think of this as selecting a meaning from a catalog of options and seeing if and how they align to the meaning that a speaker is addressing. This is really fun, and often terrible, when you hear people from different disciplines try to have conversations with one another. It can be very interesting, or kind of depressing in a comedic way. We're not talking about that definition of this word, we're talking about this definition of this word, which makes us different from you. Now, what if a sign is something we all understand? A stop sign means you gotta stop, right? Then you have what is known as a denotation, a denotive meaning. Think of this as the word you'd find if you looked it up in a dictionary or a vocabulary guide. For Barthes, myths serve an ideological function, which we can take as a shorthand for a worldview. The ideological function for Barthes was about naturalization. Naturalization makes dominant cultural values, attitudes, and beliefs appear as, well, natural, timeless, objective, and true. Through myth, you get a sense of that's the way it is, that's the way it has been, and that's the way it'll always be. With the Barthes readings, your job as you go through them is to look at how myth and signs work, and to analyze how myth can work as a system of semiology, which is highly dependent on a signification process. We're constantly talking in myths, reading them, decoding them, and letting them have a place in our lives. We also do so as people who have certain perspectives, people who have certain lineages, and people with certain affinities. Barthes' Mythologies is a collection of his work regarding certain myths, as well as how the system of myth works. And again, after reading it, you're going to play a bit of Spot the Myth, because you'll notice these things in your life. Let's pivot now to the Dorsey and Harlow article on Roosevelt and the myth of Americanism, and analyze what that does. Dorsey and Harlow talk about immigrants and the meaning of being an American during a tumultuous time. They ask about what it meant to be an American, and about how immigrants could acclimate into American society. They talk about Roosevelt as offering an alternative picture of the immigrant, who has always had to balance goals which were conflicting and difficult to legislate. If you look at page 56, the writers mention how Roosevelt grasped the complexities of immigration. These complexities were not without controversy, as the authors note. Quote, whether Roosevelt was racist is an arguable point, one that depends greatly on the criteria used. Irrespective of this point, however, his rhetoric on immigration continues to resonate in the collective awareness of American culture. It is important, then, to understand the rhetorical dynamics of his discourse, and how that discourse helped to shape a public consciousness of immigration and American citizenship. So how does this relate to myth? Well, as per page 58, when they talk about his mythic narrative, they write about how it, quote, provided his contemporaries with the means to embrace immigration more willingly. This was before the melting pot concept. The authors write, thus we argue that Theodore Roosevelt's The Winning of the West attempted to popularize simultaneously the idea of immigration and of assimilation in American culture through a mythic narrative that grounded both the origins of American society and the future strength of its people in immigration and in martial struggle. According to the authors, Roosevelt reworked the American myth, making immigrants into heroic figures who got rid of their old world ways to win the West. I'd like to point out, however, that winning the West was definitely a very ugly enterprise in many ways. Looking at page 62, the writers state, by retelling America's origin as the epic struggle of immigrant heroes engaged in daring deeds in the North American wilderness, Theodore Roosevelt attempted to define the meaning of American for the modern era. The winning of the West offered both citizens and recent arrivals a place in the myth, thereby providing the opportunity to forge a national culture from diverse elements. Herein lies the power of myth in general, and of the frontier myth in particular. Question 2. How does myth relate to rhetoric as you understand it? The authors write about how myth is important, but also how myth can have ugly aspects. For instance, look at Roosevelt's opinions on certain people from certain bloodlines. But it is interesting to see how Roosevelt mobilized myth, used it, and applied it to political ends. Immigration and assimilation were incorporated into a political ideology, and there are indeed a lot of things many of us could take issue with there, which leads us to question 3. What are some of the author's concerns about Roosevelt's use of myth? I'd like to finish off this rundown of the reading with a series of questions from the authors. Quote, though this myth is pervasive, it leaves unanswered the questions that accompany assimilation. How much of his or her heritage must the immigrant give up? Just what comprises this crucible now? What concessions should Americans make to truly assimilate the newcomer? And what is the result? Can the term American mean a single thing over time, or is its changeability the very character of this nation? Before we finish, we should look at some issues people have with structuralism. Understanding these concerns is important to understand how new systems came about. Some claim structuralism is anti-humanistic, which means it comes from something outside of discourse and culture and exchange, even when it seems to be steeped in the kind of everyday discourse we all engage in. Others take issue with it for being ahistorical, which may also reflect frustrations with the lack of opportunity for change or transformation. Power dynamics can be ignored or even thought of as seeming to be natural in and of themselves, just like the signs and myths Barthes critiques. Here, communication would just exist as a decoding practice, where human experiences are reduced to systems of language, which, although complex and difficult, could still be interpreted as limiting. Being aware of these issues led scholars to a lot of intriguing ideas and systems, which proceeded from the frame of structuralism, but created entirely new arguments about the nature of myth, signs, symbols, communication, and how to look at things and see what they mean, or what they might not mean. I know it's a longer reading, but hopefully it's one you'll enjoy. The wrestling bit in particular is a great favorite. Take care, be safe, see you online.